Thank you so much for joining us here on WTOL 11 Plus. Back in early May, WTOL 11 released a series of special reports investigating the employee housing at Cedar Point. Now, joining me this afternoon is lead investigator Brian Duggar, also Kalie Marantette, who worked alongside you here for this series of investigations. A whole week-long report that we put out there. How did this whole thing get started? It took a lot of time.
Yeah, it really started with a court case. We had found something searching through court cases, and we had found that a young woman had sued Cedar Point, claiming that she had been sexually assaulted in the Cedar Point dorms. So at that point, once we found that case, we're like, maybe we should see if there are other cases. So we reached out to the Sheriff's Department, did a records request for any type of sexual assault inside Cedar Point housing, and we just looked at last year, and what we found, there were 10 cases in 2021 of reports filled out for sexual assault. So at that point, we're like, well, maybe we should go back 5 years to see what else we can find. And what we ultimately ended up finding were 27 reports that have been filed in the past 5-year period, and it really kind of took off from there.
You know, America's roller coaster here. We're talking about a huge business and one Ohioans love, really. And so all over the state, this has impacts. And you all worked with our sister stations across the state on these reports.
Yeah, we did. I mean, we had worked with, we decided to bring WKYC in Cleveland and WBNS from Columbus in with us. And it's for that very reason, you know. Across the state, I mean, Cedar Point is this iconic amusement park, and we also believe that, you know, Cleveland and Columbus, they're very big, powerful stations, and they have great investigative teams. So we thought it would be very useful to bring them in just to increase the amount of pressure that we could put on Cedar Point and our ability to reach out to any type of additional victims, and it's worked very well, that partnership.
And both of you spoke and interviewed and sat down with these victims to hear their stories, hear what they had been through. Did you recognize any kind of common thread with these interviews?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the women talked about that most of the time they didn't know the person that sexually assaulted them. A lot of cases there was alcohol involved, you know, a lot of drinking, drugs that are happening at the dorms. And then also the most common theme is that they felt like they weren't being listened to and they weren't being believed, and they were discouraged or deterred from reporting. We heard that from most people, not even that we included in our stories, but we were making phone calls to. I mean, we called dozens of people that reached out to us, and there was a common theme with all of them.
Yeah, and you kind of set the scene a little bit about these dorms. Talk a little bit about the environment there.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you think about college dorms. I mean, you go away and you got a bunch of young people, and typically the people living in the Cedar Point dorms are about 18 to 22. They have an age limit, which they changed a couple years ago. You cannot be older than the age of 29 and living in Cedar Point housing. So there are dorms and there are also apartments, and it is where the Cedar Point employees work or live, and what we found out in talking to people is that there really was very little oversight when you talk about what's going on in the dorms. I mean, they have RAs, or they have a security guard at the front desk, but over and over people told us that, well, there's a lot of underage drinking going on, even a lot of drug use we heard from people, and it wasn't drug use that was always taking place in secret inside the dorms. I mean, one young woman told us that people would just freely walk down the hallway, you know, smoking pot, and it's just something we heard over and over, that, you know, it wasn't like a college dorm in the sense that there wasn't that much oversight and people paying attention, that it was young people having fun over the summer and not a lot of people keeping an eye on them, unfortunately.
And to add to that too, with the security and the RAs and stuff, we heard from multiple people as well that their RAs weren't there, or there was just no RAs stationed there, period. No security, you know, you could just walk right in, and you could walk in with a group of workers. So I could walk in with a group of employees and I would just be let in. So security was loose. We heard that a lot from these women too.
So probably surprising for people at home, who you're, learning this information. Our viewers are learning this information. And as you begin to collect, these police reports and hear these claims, what is, the goal of this investigation?
Well, I mean, the goal more than anything was to give these young women, and there have actually been men who have reached out to us, but to give them a voice to be heard, because they tell us over and over that they weren't being heard. And of course we wanted more oversight. I mean, I would want to be able to send my daughter to Cedar Point and have a memorable summer. And at this point, I can honestly say I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. So I think our goal is we kind of want to get changes in the dorms, make sure that these kids are safe. But we also wanted the Cedar Point Police. They were not very transparent with us. And, they have fought to prevent us from getting any type of records. So we wanted a change there. And so we think that's very important.
And so there are two different agencies here involved. So you have Cedar Point Police, you have Sandusky Police as well. And that's where you got most of your records from, because you did say there was some pushback from Cedar Point Police trying to say, well, we don't have to give you that information because we're a private entity.
Sure, yeah. So let's say something happens at the dorms and they call 911. It could be dispatched to Cedar Point Police. That was the previous case until Friday happened, which we can talk about that.
Yeah.
But so Cedar Point Police could come and they could take records, or they could do whatever. If an arrest needed to be made or something was more serious, that's when they would call in Sandusky Police. And that's all from our reports was from Sandusky, because Cedar Point Police was arguing it's a private entity. They're not subject to public records requests. So they weren't giving us anything at all, not being transparent. Sandusky Police was. They were being very transparent, giving us closed cases, details on that. So yeah, there was kind of this, who responds, who do we trust, who can we get these records from? And it wasn't Sandusky Police.
It
was Sandusky Police, it was not Cedar Point Police.
Yeah, but speaking of that, there's been a huge development with this in the last week, in the last few days. Cedar Point is going to be taking a step back here, right?
Yeah, at this point, the city of Sandusky is going to take over all policing power when it comes to incidents that happen at Cedar Point and on Cedar Point property. And when we were talking about police before, I mean, Sandusky would respond to felony level incidents, but there were a lot of misdemeanor type incidents that we don't have a record for. And when you think of sexual imposition, that is a misdemeanor in the state of Ohio. So even the Sandusky police chief he couldn't tell us that, yeah, I can guarantee you that we were called all the time. So the important thing about this news that happened on Friday is that, yeah, now Sandusky's going to handle all the policing, and Cedar Point's going to be a police force. And what that's going to mean is that there's always going to be a public record of anybody's incident that they report to police.
Of course, you all are going to be staying on top of that, I would imagine, just to check in and see how things are going. So what is the next step here in this investigation? Because I know it's certainly not the end.
Yeah, so we've actually reached out to a lot of former Cedar Point police officers, dating all the way back, to the late 90s, I want to say. I talked to a couple that were in the early 2000s talking about the culture that they felt then, and then also talking to some that, worked as late as 2019 and left, talking about what the culture was there and kind of comparing the two. So we have talked to a few of them and gotten their stories about what they've seen and what they've been told and their experiences. So we're going to be looking into that next.
Yeah, and I know you both have tried relentlessly to try to get information from Cedar Point. Any sort of interview, any sort of sit down, any sort of discussion, really, and that just hasn't happened, has it?
It really hasn't happened. And in my mind, Cedar Fair, which owns Cedar Point, I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar company. They have a lot of people in their communications that know how to handle crisis management. And I believe it's kind of definitely an effort on their part, probably hoping that this just kind of all blows over and that anything they say to us could only make the situation worse. It's not what I believe. I believe it would be best for just to sit down and talk to us.
Sure.
We want to hear their side. But at this point, you're right. I mean, they're not talking to us. And even to this point, there were a couple people that had promised us interviews this week, and they apparently seem to be backing out of those interviews.
Okay. All right, so you are going to stay on top of this, again, talking with some former police officers, continuing to request those records to see what happens, and hopefully we will see that maybe things aren't happening. You know, things are getting better, hopefully, in that housing, because as you mentioned, you someday maybe want to send a kid there to work and know that it is a safe place, as so many people love Cedar Point and love spending their summers there.
Yeah, and one thing that is interesting that's happened recently is that we continue to request any sexual assault incidents that are happening in the dorms. And in previous years, you would typically see 3, 4 a month maybe. And we requested for the last month period, we had seen 1 sexual assault back in early May, right after the park opened. But over the last month, there have been no sexual assault reports filed.
Okay.
The problem with that is that I spoke to a former employee who left in the last few months, and she kind of worked with RAs, and she said that nothing has changed. It's that she feels people feel discouraged because they've seen Cedar Point's response to this. And just the lack of caring that's being felt from these employees is making them say, well, why should I report because nothing's going to change? Or they're just intimidated. They're seeing how these employees are being treated after they report. So it's kind of discouraging them. And that's what the feel is from employees that I've spoke to.
Right, and we also have to wonder, I mean, this investigation obviously has impacted Cedar Point in some way. So is the park making a concerted effort to make sure, A, maybe they're doing better security in the dorms, maybe, or maybe they're just making a bigger effort not to get this information out there. I hope that's not the case, but we don't know. We're going to continue to look into it.
Right,
That's what I want to find out.
Right, you'll continue to push for that. Folks, we really thank you for your reporting on this and investigation. It's so important, and thanks for joining us today. Thank you for joining us here on WTOL 11+.